Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Team Made Apart podcast is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammadeapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Team Made Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Team Made Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammadeapart.com/talent. That's teammadeapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our Happy Little Podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammadeapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be made in any amount and would go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammadeapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thanks in advance for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Welcome back to the Team Made Apart podcast. Today's special guest is thought leader, storyteller, and CEO at Radious, Amina Moreau. Amina is an athlete, entrepreneur, and challenge seeker who has established a number of successful companies and left a couple of successful exits in her wake. Her latest venture, Radious, is a work-from-home office solution for remote workers on the go, looking for a place to work whenever or wherever they are. Think airBNB for work from home. More than a successful business leader, Amina is also a master communicator who believes in the tool of storytelling as an integral part of remote team leadership. After all, people make decisions from the heart, not from bulleted lists or PowerPoint slides. Here to discuss the role of storytelling in remote leadership specifically, but in communication at large, the importance of strong communication when leading a team, and also how we might commit to a safe and reasonable return to the office or not. Please join me in welcoming to the show the amazing Amina Moreau. Hey, Amina, how are you?
I'm great and so flattered. My cheeks are turning a little rosy with that intro. That's so kind of you. Thanks.
Well, good. I mean, it's sort of like a super brief life sketch. There's actually a lot more story there. And so I wonder if maybe we could start this conversation with that. Let's talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and how we ended up here.
It's been a windy journey, but in a nutshell, I have a background in both psychology and storytelling. And I feel like those are two critical skills that every human should probably have, because psychology is kind of the programming of our brain, and storytelling is how we connect with each other, right? From caveman days to today. And so my entrepreneurial journey has largely been in the storytelling space and helping people just communicate better with each other, whether it's in a marketing sort of context or a public speaking context or just having a good conversation. And I feel like that's relevant in pretty much every industry. And sometimes we don't necessarily give it the attention that it deserves. Or on the flip side, these days storytelling has become a little bit of a buzzword and it's become meaningless because of it. So I'm really passionate about clarifying that and using it as such a powerful powerful tool for getting ideas across to the people you care about.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, in life and in remote work, right? Obviously, being able to carry a conversation is a critical skill. Maybe more important even in remote work. I mean, if you can't communicate, you can't communicate. And there was a video of yours I was watching that had you were basically showcasing this old meme about storytelling, where it sort of shows in the top half of the screen, it's got a box that's just a straight line from beginning to end, right? That's it. That's the whole story. Mm-hmm. And then there's a version of it that is this windy, spaghetti bowl that talks about all the different tangents that we all take, right? And I'm a notorious tangent taker, especially when I write. I get super wordy, and so for me it hit very close to home. But what I loved about it is it really illustrated the importance of just being succinct, being giving the information that's needed, but not more than is needed. And I think that that's a really important skill in especially business communications. Do you mind talking a little bit about just sort of developing some good skills for business communication?
Yeah. Well, one of them is reading the room, or, the proverbial room, and understanding not just what you want to say, but what your intended audience needs to hear, which requires some empathy, sometimes requires some research. But knowing, when people think about storytelling, they think primarily, well, what do I want to communicate? But that's only part of the equation. The other part is really understanding who your counterparts are and what their needs are, what their desires are, what their pain points are in order to create a message that's relevant to both of you. So that's one. And I think the other big one, to your point about being succinct, that's definitely part of it. But I like to say that the order in which information is presented is sometimes more important than the information itself. And I love using the analogy of the joke, right? If we're at, happy hour and we got a really great joke to tell, if we tell it out of order and we lead with the punchline, the whole thing is going to flop. There's a reason that jokes are told in the order they are, because you've got to build a little bit of anticipation, a little bit of suspense, if you will, and then hit with that punchline, and it's either surprising or, it's funny in some way, and that's why it works. And so often in our communications, we break that rule, and we lead with all this good stuff, all of the important and really fascinating stuff, and then the rest of the video or the speech or the email is just a bunch of kind of stuff tacked on to the end that isn't really as compelling at all and doesn't have a good story arc to it. And then we ask ourselves, oh, well, why does everybody drop off our corporate videos halfway through? And they assume it's because people have short attention spans online. And I don't think that's the reason. Sure, we do have short attention spans, or rather we have a lot of things pulling us in different directions, but more often than not, we just haven't structured our stories well.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you make that delineation between sort of a short attention span versus just being bombarded with stuff, right? Because I think you're right. I think it really is more to do with the amount of stuff we're being bombarded with than it is to do with attention span. I know that for me personally, I can easily go down a YouTube rabbit hole on all kinds of nonsense that's totally irrelevant, that doesn't move my needle, doesn't do anything, but I'm compelled for one reason or another, right?
Sure.
And I may have that equally limited attention span, as so many do, but nonetheless, I have all the time in the world for this dumb thing, right? Whatever it is. And so I think that that's a great point. And it's funny too, listening to you talk, I think you and I have at least some things in common in terms of background. I come from advertising and marketing, and I happen to know that you're a filmmaker. And so the way that you're describing laying out a story, or in my world, it'd be the way we construct an ad or construct a sales piece or something. It's very similar in that, there's sort of a beginning, middle, and an end. But for some reason, I don't know if it's just sort of the advent of new technologies that allow us to be sort of succinct and off the cuff, and we don't really need to think about our stories, or what it is. Do you have any insights on why we've become such poor communicators?
That's a really good question. Well, I do think that part of it is not considering the person that we're talking to and what they really care about, and assuming that they care about the thing we care about just because we care about it. Sometimes we don't look at the expression on their face to know, oh, we've got to wrap this up. But it's also easier to not be succinct. in the film world, a lot of people, they charge per finished minute of a film. And I don't like that approach to pricing, because it's actually harder to create something more succinct. It's easier to blather on and on than to really get to the point tightly. And I don't think we've devolved. I don't think we've become worse at it over time. I think we are improving. And I think that, especially in the context of remote work, like you were saying, it's critical that we be good communicators and recognize when we do need to elaborate and also when we don't. But I think a lot of times we assume that people need maximum backstory in order to understand the context in which we're communicating. And people are smart. They don't need all of that background information. And so we can just strip things down and really evaluate, what do people need? What do I really need to express? But it takes work. It takes some effort to think about that ahead of time versus just jumping right in.
Well, and I think that is one of the words that comes up all the time. And I should make a drinking game out of this. The number of times I say intentional, right? And so I think so much of what we're doing in our remote work communications, but just communication in general, is that we should be more intentional with what we're doing. We don't need to say everything that comes off the top of our head. And I'm happy to hear you say that you don't believe we've devolved, because you spend too much time on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, and you might second guess that opinion. But I do appreciate the optimism, because I think it's important that we do continue to grow. And especially in times where we've been forced into remote work, like during this pandemic, the opportunities to, I guess, rise to the occasion are maybe greater than ever. Have you seen any, I guess, really great success stories or models you could show of people who've made a transformation or who might have become a better communicator throughout this crisis? And I think, honestly, yourself could be included, because I know that you made some big strides during the pandemic.
Well, I mean, I could talk about myself for hours. I will say that there are definitely things that have improved about my own communication that have been critical to the success of building the team that I'm building right now. And it's largely around the idea of assumptions. So the startup that I'm building, we have a small team that we've assembled remotely during a pandemic. Some of us have never met in person before, but have been working together for months. Some of us in different capacities for almost a year, and never have been in a room together physically. And one of the mistakes that I was making from a communication standpoint at the beginning was assuming that people didn't want to be bothered on weekends. Out of respect.
Sure.
Because
yeah.
I'm asking.
It's the weekend.
It's a weekend, and a lot of people are kind of volunteering for this effort right now because we're a very early stage startup. And so I want to be as respectful as I possibly can of communication and boundaries and things like that. And so I wasn't engaging people on weekends, even though I was working around the clock. And what I realized was almost everybody that is working on this platform has a day job or is working on something else in another capacity because they need to live. And weekends for some of these teammates are the only time that they can devote energy into this project. And so my stepping back and not communicating with them was actually in some ways causing a problem because they needed to have either feedback or some kind of interaction in order to do the work that they were so passionately going after. And so the big lesson for me from both a leadership and a communication standpoint was I can't make assumptions that people either want to work differently from me or want to work in the exact same ways that I have to. What I have to do is have honest conversations with people about their preferences and about mine, and align on where we have overlaps, but also recognize where we have differences and respect them, and also come to terms with the fact that sometimes we're going to step on each other's toes, whether by accident or out of necessity, because startup life is grueling and we've got to just get through the hard stuff sometimes. But having those discussions and having them from the heart, recognizing that it's not always going to be peachy, but we'll get through it together if we truly care about each other, that has been so pivotal. And those are the kinds of conversations that don't have to be succinct.
Yeah.
They don't have to be super pre-planned and organized with a great punchline. They just have to come from the heart.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I love what you're pointing out here, this idea about, not making assumptions, because especially on remote teams, it's really easy for, not just remote leaders, but other workers among themselves to fall victim to sort of the voices in their head, right? All the things we don't know, we sort of fill in the gaps with our own beliefs or our own thoughts or our own whatever. So maybe if you're not sending an email over on a Friday, that translates into, well, how come Amina doesn't want to work with me? Or how come I'm not being included in this conversation, or what are they doing this weekend and they're not calling me, or, whatever it is, right? I mean, these types of situations come up all the time. And so I think it's really important to point that out, because we are, obviously human and we fall victim to some of these things. But I think bringing awareness to this idea that, making these assumptions and operating on them, can be problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And I think also just recognizing that well-intentioned actions can have unintended consequences. And so those assumptions that I was making them out of respect for the people that were giving me so generously their time. So it's not like I was ill-intentioned, but it had negative consequences. And so I also think that a level of humility and vulnerability and just being able to take a step back and critically assess how are we conducting ourselves, what are our behaviors, and being willing to even self-criticize in an objective way, not to berate ourselves, but to just be open to improve is going to go a long way. But then, another drinking game catchphrase is vulnerability being thrown around. I think that there are different types of vulnerability, but simply being open to feedback from our teams, that is a level of vulnerability. And some are more willing to show that than others.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important, right? I mean, more communication is really the trick here. I mean, if we're trying to be vulnerable, we do need to sort of express our things. I did had a conversation the other day when we were talking about a couple leaders who, really high level folks, executives in this company, CEO, CTO, COO. They were all working for the same company, but they hadn't shared with one another what their personal goals for success were. They had all sort of aligned around a company vision and things like that. But, and I'm just making this part up, but, so-and-so wants to live in Bermuda. So-and-so wants to just work from home. So-and-so wants, whatever. And each of them have these different objectives that they're working towards, but they're not communicating them to one another, right? So while we feel like we're united around this common cause, which is our business, we're actively working against one another in some cases because we're not aware of what's going on. So I think it's really important to share those ideas.
Yeah. And if I can take that a step further too, I feel like this transition that we're in the middle of, that doesn't have an end in sight quite yet, into remote and hybrid work, there really is going to be an evolution. And I believe quite strongly that companies aren't just going to set a policy, announce it, and then we'll be off to the races. I feel like this is going to be an iterative process, that we're going to maybe put something out there, test it, get feedback, try to break it, improve on it. And that's harder to do. It's easier to just set it and forget it. But I think that setting it and forgetting it is going to be more prone to bigger failures than this idea of continuous improvement. But that's where communication becomes even more critical. Because when things do encounter a roadblock, there is a kink to work out, we have to be able to talk about it openly so that we can improve it together, and also recognize, hey, that was imperfect, our bad. Let's move on. Let's learn from it and make things better. But if you don't communicate about it, then people might assume, management doesn't know what they're doing, versus making it a team effort. So everybody, has buy-in and feels like they've been a part of crafting it. But then because there have been a multiple of perspectives infused into the vision, you're accounting for that diversity of perspectives, and it's more likely to work, I believe, in the end.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think what you're describing is sort of, or it feels like anyway, sort of the startup mentality, right? This is the way that a lot of companies are being built these days, where it really is. You start with a small bootstrap team and you sort of build, you get your MVP out there, and then you iterate and iterate and iterate, right? Versus maybe some of these older dinosaurs or these more archaic, larger organizations that have been doing things a certain way for so long, right? So I think you're right that the ability to be agile and communicate openly about it is really going to help some companies succeed, or at least come out of this situation that we find ourselves in now a little better off than the competition.
Yeah. And I do see some bigger companies innovating in the space and showing up as leaders, but I do also see some big companies lagging behind and making statements that make them seem really inflexible. And that's not to say that they're all just saying, everyone's going to come back to the office 100%. Yeah. I think there are more gray areas to it than that. But one thing that I think is key for companies to be considering right now and not later is that now is the opportunity to show up as a leader in a very quickly evolving space. But maybe more importantly is that if you right now make an investment in your teams by offering them what they feel they really need to do their best work and to have a great sense of well-being. If you do that now, you will be perceived as an employer that truly cares about their team. If you do it months from now, when everybody has done it and you've been left behind, and then you start implementing these flexible policies that give people more freedom, you're going to be perceived as the laggard that had to do it, not because they cared about their team and wanted to offer it as quickly as possible, but as an employer that was going to be left behind if they didn't do it, and so they were forced to.
Yeah.
And those teams are going to suffer because of it, and some of the key players on those teams might move on simply because they recognize, hey, this wasn't a genuine move.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, one of the big issues that keeps coming up, this will be our third drinking game thing that comes up, at least during this season of the podcast, is this idea that I believe it sort of would be a disservice to companies to not, appreciate their evolution over these last 12 months and, move forward from here versus this whole concept of the new normal or getting back to the way things were. And you're seeing things, you sort of referenced, companies returning back to the office and things like that. And, right now there's a study that came out recently that showed something like 62% of businesses are saying we're going back to the office, get back to the office. Yet something like 96% of people are saying I would like to have at least a little flexibility in my day. That doesn't necessarily mean fully remote or whatever. Maybe it's one day a week or whatever, but nonetheless, they're looking for flexibility. And I think what you're describing anyway is the importance or sort of the value of listening to your people, right? And I think that there's kind of a two-way street that has to happen here, right? You need to look at business objectives and things like that. And can your business thrive this way? And maybe if you have some data that says we can't, then maybe we could work with that data and try and understand why we couldn't maybe be remote. But I think it's really important that you at least weigh these factors versus this sort of, egalitarian, no, we're not going, we're going back to the office and that's that sort of approach. So, so I think you're right. And this goes back and maybe to our storytelling topic, which is this idea of communication and how do we communicate what it is we actually want to do? I mean, I suspect most of these companies of this 50, whatever, some percent that say we're going back, I imagine with a little bit of finessing, they probably don't really mean 100% back to the office. I don't care what you think.
Probably.
They probably mean something softer than that. And so,
probably.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that the CEO of airBNB recently said it kind of perfectly, that it's actually probably not going to be up to the employers what happens. It's going to be up to the employees at the end of the day. companies are going to have to adjust to what their top talent wants and needs. We'll see how it really plays out in practice, but if the directions are vastly different on both party sides, then there has to be flexibility somewhere. Otherwise, these companies are going to lose really, really valuable people. And I don't know that they're prepared to do that at the, just because they were inflexible. So I agree with you. I think that those who say we're coming back to the office, I think that they either are recognizing that that is a semi-permeable membrane, that there will probably be a hybrid plan put into place. And some companies probably don't realize it yet, but will eventually soften their stance.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, to your point, I mean, they're almost going to have to, right? I mean, if you want great retention and you want to keep your best talent and things like that, you're going to have to bend a little bit. And I mean, you've seen this, over the last, I don't know, even the last 20 years in the, I guess, traditional co-located workspace, how far things have shifted, right? I mean, employers are, now you get lunch at work, and now you can, have unlimited vacation time or whatever, right? These are examples of, employees speak and we listen kind of policies, right? And so there's definitely been an evolution over the years, and maybe this is a little bit more dramatic, but one of the things that has come up is this idea that, basically over the course of this last year, I mean, people have had a variety of ups and downs, right? I mean, some people were affected more negatively than others. Some have managed to thrive, whatever. But this idea that we could go back to the way it was, and just run back to our office and that's that, and not take into account sort of the things that have gone on. Maybe people have lost family and friends. Maybe they've got a spouse who lost a job and needs to stay home now, or, maybe, I mean, who knows? It could be a broad range of things. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think it would be a disservice to the people who've suffered over the last year to try and pretend it didn't happen. And rather, we should be looking at our evolution, looking at our innovation, and then taking those things and applying them to wherever we go forward, versus this, idea of going back to the way it was.
Yeah, I think that's a really great sentiment. We have to recognize that. And, people keep throwing around the term new normal. And I don't know, I feel like it's kind of a new future, maybe. We have some opportunities here to make things better, more empathic, more with a higher priority on well-being. And when I say that, I don't just mean rest and work-life separation, but connection to one's work. People do their best work when they're intrinsically motivated to do it. And when there's too much friction, that's when you lose that drive to just do it because you love it. Not because you're being paid, not because your boss expects you to, but because you love your work. And we really have an opportunity to provide that space, whether it's literal space or it's metaphorical brain space, for us to be doing our best work and truly enjoy it. And I hope that companies don't squander that opportunity.
Well, I think you're right. And I really like the way you're talking about all this stuff too, because you're spending a lot of time on sort of the positive side, right? This is opportunity. This is, not something that's happened to us. We haven't been forced, but rather this is an opportunity to really move the needle and do better. And, especially as it pertains to like mental health issues and things like that, I think we're, more acutely aware of them now, maybe than we've ever been. In terms of physical health and other things, a lot of companies were making progress in that path, prior to the pandemic, but now during it, it's become front and center. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that evolution and companies taking advantage. And well, I shouldn't say advantage, but they're seizing the opportunity, and sure. And I think they'll be the ones that are better for it in the end. I wonder if we couldn't maybe transition into a little bit about sort of, this is obviously a key thing in remote work, but, communicating trust, I guess, because so much of what we do is reliant on us actually believing what the people speaking to us are telling us. And so as it pertains to storytelling, are there ways that we can become, maybe more authentic or more trustworthy or communicate better so that, the message is coming across as authentic and people can better understand our story?
Yeah. Well, one big one is show, don't tell. And this is something that in the film world, we would be talking about in terms of what is said in an interview or what is said in a voiceover versus what is shown in B-roll. But in real life, what it pertains to is the fact that actions speak louder than words. And it's the same thing, that when we model certain behavior and we see that people are truly walking their talk, that is naturally going to feel more trustworthy than just hearing somebody say the words. So I think that is a really big one. And I feel like in the remote, especially hybrid context, where we're talking about having some people that might commute into the office 2 or 3 days a week, or maybe some people in the workforce are working permanently remotely, but not everybody at the company is. And one thing that I think we'll have to be careful of in the way that we behave from a storytelling perspective is if all the executives, if the C-suite and all of the if all the head honchos are all coming into the traditional office and the individual contributors are all working remotely, or they're taking the opportunity to work remotely, then could they be missing opportunities to grow in the company as a result? And even if they don't consciously think about it, even if it's a subconscious fear or guilt that, oh, I'm working remotely, I'm not getting daily interactions with, the key people that I need to develop relationships with and stuff like that, that could create a really big disconnect between what is being said. And we talked about unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions. Having this hybrid flexibility of working from kind of anywhere, but then having different camps of people and different, quote, classes of people choosing to be in different places, and certain places now have more potential for growth and development than others, and some people are feeling like they're being left behind. They might feel like that message of freedom and well-being and growth was disingenuous, even though it was genuine. So I really think that we have to pay attention to how we actually execute the policies that we talk about. And going back to what we said about iteration, is recognizing, like constantly auditing from a day-to-day basis, is this really working, and is it working for everyone? And if it's not, taking a really close look.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's like anything in life, right? I mean, it's not black and white, and there is not going to be a one size fits all solution. And if you're a manager who comes out of the woodwork and says, no, I've got it, this is it, then you're probably wrong. I mean, the reality is you're going to have to iterate it, and you're going to have to figure out how to accommodate people. And like we were talking about before, with just sort of the hardship people have been through over the last year, people are going to come to you with a new set of circumstances. You're going to have broken people. You're going to have people who've been doing very well. You're going to have this whole range of people. And so to try and pretend that there's a one size fits all solution that's going to cover everybody's base is I think, naive. So I think you're very right in that. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
If I can just add one more thing, I do also feel like, so there are companies that have fostered trust pre-pandemic, who have really put a great emphasis on culture. And I think that they will have an easier time with this transition than those who have been a little bit more bottom line focused and saw fostering culture as just a means to an end. And the distinction is narrow between those two, but I do think that it makes a difference. So it will be more of an uphill battle for those companies who haven't fostered trust. And maybe that's an obvious statement, but I also don't think it's impossible for them. It's never too late to improve your culture. And that's why I am seeing this as an opportunity to do just that for any size company, any age company. We all have an equal opportunity here to foster that trust and greater well-being in our teams, which will improve the bottom line at the end of the day. But we have an opportunity now, but it's a short window.
Well, and I think you're right. And I think it's that attitude, right? It's that willingness to be open to change. And, for people who are doing this right pre-pandemic, I mean, obviously there are, many companies who stand out as, folks who've been thought leaders in this space and who've done a really good job with, corporate culture and that sort of thing. But, there's certainly, equally as many or maybe more who are not known for their great company cultures. And, and I always joke that it's more than just a ping pong table, right? I mean, like there's a little bit more, put up or shut up kind of stuff going on here. Back to your idea of show, don't tell. It's not really about the jargon you can push out. Rather, it's about your actions and showing people how you can really, do what you say you'll do. And so I wonder, in the spirit of sort of this idea of do what you say you do you have any thoughts about communicating authenticity? So this is another one of those buzzy words that comes up all the time about being authentic. And, we talked a little bit about trust, but I think there's a little bit of a difference between the two things. Is there a way that we can sort of communicate our true selves without sounding too hokey in our storytelling? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I see on social media all day or I actually met you through the Clubhouse app and you get on there and you listen to people speaking all day. And there are a lot of people who are just kind of pontificating and they come off as sort of not inauthentic or not particularly genuine. They're busy going down the bullets that they've got in front of them, but they're not actually coming off as much of an expert. Is there something to this, communication style that could lead us to be maybe a little bit more authentic in our communication?
I feel like you must have seen a recent tweet of mine where I said something along the lines of, how come those folks who preach about authenticity often come off as the most fake? And the responses I got to that question were, they were eye-opening. They were very funny, some of them. But it's kind of like bragging about having humility. If you're a humble person, you're not going to talk about it. And so I think a lot of people who are speaking up about authenticity, or I've seen some clubhouse rooms with titles like looking for authentic people only. And I just wonder, I've never set foot in one of those rooms because I have this, I'm going in, like, I have this assumption that that's going to be the least authentic room of all of them in my list. And maybe I'm being too judgmental.
Yeah, maybe you'd be surprised.
Maybe I need to open my mind a little bit.
Yeah, I doubt it though. And so, but it's the same thing as, seeing the room that says, 10x success secrets today, that kind of thing. It's the same thing, right? People are promising, but it would be mighty tough to deliver that. And if you really could, what are you doing on Clubhouse? You're going to be fine elsewhere. So, anyway, it's an interesting thing for sure.
I do think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg equation though. And a good analogy that I can think of is Seth Godin wrote once on his blog about how you need to have a baseline level of trust in order to even show generosity. And while generosity can foster trust, you have to have a minimum amount of trust in order for generosity to work. And the example that he gave was if somebody had a bunch of sandwiches and they wanted to just generously give them away for free at an airport and just like put them around on random seats at a gate, and you just showed up and there was this like random sandwich on the seat at the gate, you wouldn't eat it because you don't know where it came from, why it's there. Like, we're suspicious of a random sandwich because we might not have that enough trust in order to eat it. And so in that case, the generosity is kind of wasted. And I feel like the same thing probably goes for authenticity. Because I might pour my heart out to you right now, but if we don't have a certain baseline already where you consider me to be an honest, genuine person that speaks her mind, good, bad, and ugly sort of thing, then whatever authenticity or vulnerability I show you, if we don't have that baseline trust, it could actually backfire and be perceived as a front, just a facade. And so for those companies, those teams, those rooms on Clubhouse where you don't have that baseline level of trust showing authenticity, you have to kind of be careful about it. But you also can't really build honest trust without having a level of authenticity either. And so there is it's a delicate balance. But I think that if you're just an open person that's empathic in the sense that like you can really truly put yourself in other people's shoes in a given moment, people will feel that. That goes a long way without even talking about authenticity. It's got to start somewhere, but like with any good storytelling, it's about knowing your audience, knowing what you want to say, what they need to hear, and just being there with them.
Well, that might actually lead into a good topic is how do we, I guess, identify the person it is, or do you have any tricks, I guess I should say, for maybe tricks is the wrong word, but do we have methodologies for trying to approach the appropriate audience, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to uncover or trying to understand is this idea that, we as business leaders are communicating our message to different people. And obviously we have, generalized, maybe we're talking to our employee base versus maybe talking to somebody on Clubhouse or talking to somebody on Twitter or whatever. So maybe we can identify our audience that way. But do you have any, I guess, sort of, methods for really digging into who it is you're speaking to?
Yes, I do. And the thing that's really kind of ringing as a strong bell in my head right now is the fact that you're always going to have more than one audience. Because even if you're talking to your internal audience, you're going to have different people in that audience, but then maybe also different groups in that audience, and they might look at things differently. One of my clients is a power company that provides electricity to 6 states, 3 of them blue, 3 of them red. And they have competing priorities, conflicting priorities. Those in the red states rely on certain, energy sources for the communities to survive. And in the blue states, they wanted those energy sources to be gone yesterday. And so as a company, how do you talk to 2 audiences and relate to them both without seeming two-faced? And that's a particularly extreme example because you might not have such competing priorities at a different type of company where perhaps everybody in your internal and external audience are all aligned with the mission and just have slightly different perspectives on it. But at the end of the day, if I have any kind of trick or hack, it's to find the common threads. It's to find unity, because, and goodness, I wish that we could do this just in this country. Because no matter how different our beliefs are and our backgrounds and every other way that we're different, there are always commonalities that we share. And the more we can communicate and encourage others to communicate about these commonalities, which are probably even bigger than we realize, the greater alignment we can have. And kind of bringing the analogy back to companies, we can have greater alignment on whatever it is, whether it's a particular initiative or the whole mission of the company, but then also reduce the potential for conflict in the process.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's actually, I think it's a really great point. So thank you for sharing that, because I think the concept of discovering common thread, I mean, not only is this true in remote leadership, right? I mean, we're trying to figure out, we're all working for a unified cause or whatever. And sure, some of you might be, just to use the political analogy, some might be more blue and some might be more red, but altogether we work at one company. And so we have this unifying thing in between us, or in a broader sense, we all want, health, security, air, water, these things, And so even at the most extreme, you can probably find some kind of common ground. And so I think it is really important to try and focus on that. And, I can speak from sort of the advertising realm, right? I mean, if we're producing an ad, I mean, sure, there's always a target market and things like that, but it's pretty broad, right? I mean, if we're doing a magazine ad, maybe we're going to Cadillac buyers, folks who buy Cadillacs, and maybe we know some things about that audience or something. But to try and assume we know everything, or that there's no shades of gray in that group, would be naive, right? So we focus on the things that are common, right? We all have Cadillacs or whatever it is. So I think that's a really great thing to point out, because I think you're right that just, focusing more on the commonality versus on the things that drive us apart, it makes a lot of sense.
And I have to also mention that, as I'm building this startup, that is something that actually drives me on a daily basis, especially on the hardest days, right? Because, so, I'm building effectively an online marketplace for home office space, which means it's very similar to an Airbnb type model, where if you've got extra space in your home or a guest house or something like that, turn it into an office and then rent it out to your neighbors so they can work remotely better. And what kind of keeps me going on the hardest days is very much in line with this conversation about finding common ground, because I do believe that we're at the beginning of a changing relationship between cities, suburbs, and rural areas, right? We're seeing a mass exodus of New Yorkers. People in Silicon Valley are moving to Montana. And now, if you only have to commute into the traditional office 2 days a week, 3 days a week, you can move out into the country and have more land, have a bigger house. It gives you a different level of freedom, perhaps, and not everybody, but for some. And what I see happening over time is people of different belief systems, different political parties, perhaps, starting to become neighbors. And I honestly believe that the ideal of loving thy neighbor is more possible to really live by if you're interacting with your neighbors.
Well, I think it's exactly right? I mean, if you presume to go into a place and you might feel a certain way. I mean, just, and this is of course very broad, not trying to be offensive or anything, but I mean, if you're coming from San Francisco and you're going into, Podunk, Montana or something, and I can call it Podunk because I lived in Idaho. So if you're moving from San Francisco to there, right? I mean, if you come in there and you've got your nose up in the air and your pinky out, and you're not willing to sort of look again at this common ground between you and the fellow Montanans, you're going to find yourself in a world where you're very uncomfortable and people aren't there. But it's much harder to avoid the commonalities when you're immersed in them, right? When all of a sudden you're seeing these people day in and day out and you're running into them at the store, the things that you thought you knew or all your understanding, your paradigm of life in San Francisco or LA or wherever you might have been, has now shifted, because now you understand and you're more able to empathize, right? You're more able to understand the position of somebody who is born and raised in Montana, for example.
Exactly. And you've just pinpointed precisely what kind of gets me up in the morning on the rainiest days here in Portland, Oregon.
Which is a lot of them, by the way.
It feels like startup life is impossible. And it's this idea that if folks, I do think that there's probably going to be some increased friction at first as people of different walks of life start becoming neighbors. But if my company and other companies like it can help foster more conversations, because, person of type A is maybe renting a space from person of type B. And now they're interacting on some, even a small level of collaboration, then you have now a common ground. Yeah. And perhaps, if my little startup can grow a little bigger and then a little bigger and bridge divides in this country, maybe beyond, oh my goodness, like my life purpose will have been fulfilled.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I think is so great about your idea, and again, the company we're talking about is Radious. This is her startup. And like she mentioned, it's sort of an Airbnb type setup. You have a home office and you're willing to rent it out to people who might need the space. I think you're exactly correct that, we used a broader, more general example, San Francisco to Montana or something. But the reality is I could be from Austin and fly into Montana and then work at somebody's house in Montana. And so not only is it, just sort of the general difference in terms of, location, but it's also sort of the personal differences between me and this individual. It's a little more intimate, right? Because we're sharing something on a deeper level than we would at sort of some superficial level, or if we were working at a WeWork or something, right? Like you don't maybe get the essence the same way you would in a situation like what you've got. And what I think is so interesting, or the way I think about what you're working on, is it's almost like a micro co-living. You might not be staying there, but, for the day, you guys are all working together. And if somebody happens to have some space, maybe they've got 3 or 4 people working there or something. And, and I think that can make for some really interesting things. And also even just, sort of difference in, maybe sort of financial wellness or something. I mean, you've got somebody who can, maybe is new to work and, maybe they're young, maybe they're 18 years old or something. They've just started into the workforce, don't make a lot of money, have a little flea bag apartment somewhere, but they can go to your place and use your home office as a place that they can facilitate their work. I mean, I think that you can bridge gaps between people, not only just sort of, socially or geographically, but also economically and in so many other ways.
Right. And I was also reading some articles very recently about how property values are skyrocketing in some of these communities that haven't been used to this kind of influx of newcomers, and it's creating some problems for housing affordability. But if now you can rent out a space that maybe isn't appropriate for long-term rental or for listing on a short-term rental site like Airbnb or VRBO, and now you can make a little bit of supplemental income by renting it out as just daily use office space. And now that housing affordability challenge perhaps is mitigated a little bit. So, I mean, there are always two sides to every coin, but I really want this to be a social effort and not just another marketplace.
Well, I love that. And this is, I mean, something that I've sort of learned about you in my sort of cursory look at you and learning, about you prior to this interview was that, there tends to be sort of I wouldn't call it maybe a social movement, but there's for sure a why with you. Like the things that you're drawn to, tend to, or at least the things that I've seen so far, tend to have sort of a reason for being, right? We're not just arbitrarily throwing this website up. Rather, you're throwing this website up because you actually intend to make things better for people. Or, there's another organization that you kicked off during the pandemic, this idea, Float Small Business. And the Float Small Business idea, also, I mean, it's going to create a bunch of work for you. It's going to be a whole thing. It's all this stuff. But nonetheless, it's backed by this tremendous why, which is how can we save small business right now during a pandemic? And I think it's really impressive. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, Float Small Business initially just started as really a directory of businesses that had either gift cards or GoFundMe campaigns as a means of survival. And so I just created this directory that was categorized by business type. So if you wanted to support a restaurant, you could, or a bookstore, or an artist. And if you clicked on the links, it would take you either to their gift cards that you could purchase and redeem later, or not redeem at all if you wanted to be super generous, or it would take you to their GoFundMe page and you could contribute that way. And the idea was spawned just from the fact that these small businesses, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, but throughout, were really suffering and some were closing down. And I just wanted to provide a conduit for people that could afford to help financially to be able to do so better. So it was an entirely volunteer basis, and I had people in the community helping me, and we built this site, and it was totally commission free. It was just about supporting people. And then eventually it evolved into a pledge about reopening responsibly. And this was before we really had mask mandates. It was before we really knew what responsibly meant. But we were a community that was coming together and listening to our governments, but also just putting our common sense hats on. And how can we make our customers and our employees feel safe? And so we created the pledge. And then eventually we launched a podcast also where we could speak to small businesses about how they've found a way to survive so that other small businesses could learn from mistakes, but also from successes too. And I have to say that creating this initiative in 2020 helped me survive 2020 too, just from an emotional perspective, because I get so much satisfaction and just purpose from helping people, but I just saw things all crashing down around me and I just felt kind of useless. What can one person do in this situation? And so Float Small Business was a way to do that. And it just gave me a North Star in a very difficult time. So as much as it was about helping other people, I wouldn't have survived 2020 without it.
Well, and I think back to this concept of common ground that we've been talking about, right? This was a North Star for you, but I imagine it was also a North Star for many of the people who used the platform or made the pledge or appeared on the podcast, whatever. And, this gave them something also, so, and again, the common ground was we all needed guidance. We all needed a North Star, and here it is. So I think that's really beautiful. I wonder, just to sort of tie it back to remote work while we're here in these last couple moments of the show, have there been any insights, things like that you might have picked up from that experience that you would sort of share with an audience in terms of responsibly reopening? And the reason I ask is for a topic we've sort of discussed, but now there's this big push, to get us back in the offices, at least in some capacity. You're seeing now in the news, mask mandates going away and some of these other things. And there appears to be some sort of sense of reopening that's sort of, trickling across the country at this point. And so I wonder if you had learned anything or if there was anything valuable, some takeaways that you had that might benefit people as they're starting to reopen or as they're going back to try and look for new work or as they're transitioning to remote or whatever.
Yeah, goodness. So many good thoughts there. First, I want to say that for anybody that is going back to the office or going into public office spaces like co-working, I really feel like ventilation and HVAC needs to be a bigger priority. And look, here's a little asterisk. I was a germaphobe before the pandemic, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But for the podcast that I just mentioned, I did interview an HVAC engineer as we were going into the winter months. And we had some pretty nerdy conversations about the ins and outs of HVAC. And I get that that's not a topic that's going to interest everybody, but air quality was an issue before the pandemic hit us. Sick building syndrome was a real thing that affected a lot of people. And we were looking at air quality more as we were really doing a cost benefit analysis, and the priority was on cost savings. And with cost savings come energy savings and environmental concerns. So I don't want to hamstring the environmental and sustainability side, because I do think that's important. But all of the strides that we have made for sustainability not all of them are being undone now, but when you open all your windows in the middle of winter, it's not an energy efficient way to go about things. It's more expensive and it's worse for the environment, but it's better during a pandemic. So one thing I think that we need to be thinking of is the trade-offs. And I feel like this is kind of a theme of our episode here, that there are no easy answers. But working from home isn't the be-all, end-all answer either. Working remotely, I have to just interject that I don't think working from home and working remotely are synonyms either. There are so many ways to work remotely. But when we're thinking about all those things, even if we don't have a mask mandate, which some states, like you mentioned, are loosening those regulations, as companies, we have to be thinking about our employees and just our own health. And in talking to that HVAC engineer, one thing that I learned is that there are some very easy and very cheap ways to increase your indoor air quality significantly. And so it doesn't mean huge upgrades. It doesn't mean huge costs for a lot of us. It could be as simple as, grabbing a ladder and checking what percentage of the air is recycled and what percentage of the air that comes in is new air. And playing with that ratio. It could be as simple as that.
Yeah.
But we're not doing it.
It's interesting. So in my research, I did happen to come across this episode where you were talking to this HVAC guy. And one of the things he was talking about, and this is, not super remote work related, but I will do my best to tie it back, is, he was talking about humidity in buildings too. And how, the higher the humidity or sort of within a range, there is a greater resistance to, viral infection and things like that. And again, it's a relatively easy fix. And, actually we had I host another business centric podcast. And on that show, on eggs, we had a guy named Dr. Jeff Gusky, and same thing. He's experimenting with humidity and, raising humidity levels indoors for reasons of, reducing viral, transmission. And so, so it was really interesting that your guy also said the same thing, right? Because we heard this, and we put disclaimers all over it, because we don't know anything. But but at the same time, it was interesting, the parallels in the story. But I think the point is right, which is as it pertains to building sickness and some of these other problems. I mean, we may have been sticking too many people in buildings. This is the building we've got. We got to get people in it, right? But maybe now, if hybrid situations are part of our future. Or, we may be operating in a new configuration that requires less bodies in a space. Our air quality is going to be better. We might be able to raise that relative humidity to keep Dr. Gusky happy. And we might be able to have more and more fresh air coming in to keep your guy happy. And, and we may find that we're better able to take care of the health of not just ourselves, but of the people who work for us by doing that. So it may actually end up being kind of a little gift. If you allow people to work from home, at least part of the time, you may find that you can now keep your building in better condition and you can keep the air quality better. And by doing that, you're doing a lot more good than you are bad.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think there's also been a big question about whether employers are going to let their leases lapse and offload some of their real estate because they don't have as many workers coming back into the office. And maybe some people are working only 2 days a week from the office or not at all. But I think on the flip side, we might want to ask ourselves whether that real estate will still be utilized because now people have to be 6 feet apart or more. And so now you actually do need extra space in order to house fewer people. Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of let's just see how it goes.
Yeah, obviously a bottomless pit, right?
but yeah, we can make some predictions. But I think we're going to be learning some very important lessons as this thing evolves.
Yep, I think you're right, and I think has been the theme for many of the topics we've brought up. This idea that we might know it all is probably inaccurate. So I think it's probably better sometimes to just kind of go with the flow. Stay abreast, be smart, do all those things, but at the same time, just kind of we got to wait and see a little bit. So I think that's right. So, Amina, before we get out of here, do you want to tell people where is best to track you down online, whether it's, at your company websites, LinkedIn, or wherever else?
Yeah, certainly. I'm probably out of all the platforms, I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. So just search my name and I should pop up pretty quickly. And like I said, the platform that I'm building now for this remote office space solution is at radious.pro, and Radious has a quirky spelling. It's RADIOUS.pro. And we are, at the time of this recording, building up our waiting list, and we are piloting with a small group of folks and really proving the concept and learning our lessons, and we'll be scaling from there. So keep an eye out for us.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll make sure we share all those resources in the show notes and everything else. Well, thanks so much again. I'm really grateful for you to have sat down and spent this time with us. I think that the value of storytelling in our communication is critical, and with communication maybe being the most important thing or one of the most important things in remote work, I think it's really important for people to hear what you had to say. So thanks again so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks to everybody who tunes in this week and every week, and we'll see you all next time.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you.